family as I use it as an example with my family as like an ode to imperfection. It's like how but no, I'm actually
I know your
serious about-
family, they're not buying that.
No, but I'll tell
Like-
you why.
They're like,
I'll tell
Dad,
you
you're not
why-
covering.
why I'm serious about it, which is that had I not made that mistake, Mark never would have called me. And so like Mark calls me and he's like, hey, you just canceled my session. And I said, I did. And we had a really, really lovely conversation. And then Dean emailed me and like, it was like, there was all this interaction I wouldn't have had. Of course, I screwed up all your lives. So I apologize for that cost.
Yeah.
But it was
Make a habit of this. I wouldn't
yeah,
make a
definitely.
habit of this, though. It's not a.
yeah, I'm doing it for every group meeting I'm invited to. I'm going to cancel them, and then reinstate them and develop relationships in that way. That's my plan now.
Keep
Well,
us
that's
posted.
good. That's good. And I seen it must have worked because I see new faces here, some familiar, some unfamiliar to me. At any rate,
Anna,
glad.
where are you going?
I am indeed going. I'm going from New York City back to my home in Connecticut.
Ah, bye. How wave to you? Where are you now? You're not on the West Side Highway, are you?
Close. I just got off the West Side Highway. So yes,
Oh,
road and nothing could be better than being part of this workshop, which I've been wanting to be a part of for a long time. So I'm thrilled to be here with you guys today. And thank you, Peter, for canceling. Your cancel certainly inspired to be here, and that's actually why I'm here. So thank you, Peter.
see?
And
There you go.
and I apologize. I'm sorry, guys. I am a Luddite, and I was putting meetings in my calendar, and I don't know why they sent them all out to you. And then I deleted it from my calendar because I wanted to stop it from interfering, and then that canceled the meeting. So there's something Scott and I need to do a one-on-one session on how to use technology.
Yeah. May take more than one-on-one. It may have to be it may have to be an intervention.
Yeah, it might be multiple people on one, like 7 on one.
Okay, Mark. I mean,
yes.
what the heck? It's 5
Might
minutes
as,
after.
might as well begin.
Yeah.
I don't really I have a lot of observations, but I'd rather hear from everybody else. But I will just start off by saying or trying to explain why I picked, out of the millions of books out there, why I picked this one to follow the earned life as our book club discussion. Mostly it's because I needed to reread it. I think Amanda has reread it for this thing as well. Maybe some others here had done so too. But if somebody was going into coaching and asked me what they should read, probably the first thing that would come to my mind would be to read a bunch of Michael Lewis books, like Moneyball and The Blind Side, and particularly The Undoing Project, because it seems to be a subject that fascinates him, not the coaching so much, but the idea that there are different ways of approaching problems. And that's what coaches have to do, is fix somebody's problem or address somebody's problem that they can't fix themselves, right? And Lewis is a guy who seems to be fascinated by coaches. He did a podcast. He has a podcast called Against the Rules, and his whole second season was about coaching.
Yeah, one of the best podcasts of all. Everybody's listened to that podcast, right? I mean, that season on coaching was spectacular. Mark, you're absolutely right.
Right. He kind of
What's the podcast again?
It's called Against the Rules. And
he's a great podcaster too.
Yeah.
I mean, his voice, the way he interviews is just the way he tells a story. I mean, duh, right?
And he actually, and then he he's written 2 books on coaching too, little ones. One was a Sunday Times Magazine article about his baseball coach in high school. And the second one was about him coaching a baseball team. And they're not, as big as Liar's Poker and Moneyball and Blindside and all that, but he seems to be fascinated with the subject. So, and he's a great storyteller, as you say, Scott. That's the reason I wanted to pick on this book and see what you guys thought. I'm not gonna, I'll call on Amanda and ask her what she thinks about what she got out of it the second time. If that's not putting you on the spot, Amanda.
Well, he's just such an amazing writer. And I don't know how this stuff pops into his mind. I don't know if he listens to every clever thing that every clever person has ever said to him, and he just records it in his mind and then spits it back out, or whether he's amazingly clever. But the way that he expresses things are often funny or irreverent or just counterintuitive. He's an amazing storyteller, and the characters are always so richly developed. In a nonfiction book, to have characters be so fascinating is really unusual, I think. And I think that's his greatest strength.
Well, the first thing I would say about this book is that it's a product of incredibly deep reporting. I mean, can you imagine taking on a subject that's very complicated, namely this 2 scientists, very smart guys who have reordered how we think about certain behavioral things and decision making. And then you have to get the cooperation of the one who's living, Kahneman. And it takes about 5 years for Kahneman to agree to kind of approve this sort of thing. And Kahneman himself has a best-selling book already on this subject, kind of his life's work. And he's a Nobelist, and he's still alive. So he's going to be reading this thing. And this guy is a connoisseur of stupidity, that's his. And so if you, Michael Lewis, mess up, your subject will be able to see it, which I would think would be very intimidating. And as a result,
Right.
I think, but also as a result of Kahneman's blessing, he gets to talk to all the people who knew him at Tversky, and they tell you all these great stories. And I think if you read it a third time, you'll see that most of the good lines are given to other people because they said it. When you read any book, it doesn't matter who says the clever lines. That's the stuff you underline. It doesn't matter whether the author, the reporter says it. And the best way is to let other people shine, really. And so,
well, Mark, I that could be a really nice topic for maybe that's the topic you're thinking about for today is talking about how you gather these stories. Because I know you and Marshall are big gatherers of stories in the work that you do. It's not just, I think, right? Not just Marshall's stories, but you're out there collecting and looking and listening. Or maybe it is.
No, it's just talking to people, and I have a tape recorder going, so and you can do that on your iPhone now, right, Dean? And then my job is just listen to it and transcribe it, and then while I'm transcribing it, I just highlight all the really good stuff.
Right, but it also feels like in my reading of your books and of course this book as well, that it's the harmonics of those stories, right? It's not, the stories aren't just like sequential. You're laying sort of one instrument over another, and they're all working together to create sort of this new sound, right? That your book has its own voice, but the voice is really a combination of these other voices that you've heard. I think Lewis does that really well also.
Well, yeah, it's kind of a mosaic, of course, but where you're putting all these pieces together, that's Lewis's job.
Mhm.
In this case, it's such a complicated subject with not exactly a very not kind of like an elongated and comfortable through line from it, because I think of these two guys as like Lennon and McCartney. They were a great duo
Mhm.
from the early to mid 70s to they're kind of when they stopped working together in like 83 or whenever it is, and but they continued to be associated. So it's not, and then they kind of part ways. So this book is really not about a continuous story till 2022, though Kahneman is still alive, but it's really about this one magical period. And to go that far back and get all this detail, because some people are no longer alive who are critical players in the narrative. And at the same time, it's all about pretty deep, complicated stuff. The reason I read The Undoing Project rather than finish Thinking Fast and Slow is I just got confused by thinking. It was just too much. And in the end, I just treated it like popcorn. I would take out of it what I needed rather than try to understand it all. But the essence really here, it starts with Lewis and really deep reporting. And he's said this in interviews where he probably looks at 4 or 5 ideas where he starts gathering string and spends a bunch of time reporting on a story idea before he chooses to waste it, say, this is what I'm going to invest the next 3 or 4 years of my life reporting and producing as a book. So in order to do deep reporting like this, where you're going to spend so much time on it, you have to be really confident that you selected the thing you want to do. But that's how he structures his time and his career. What I'm trying to come up with is stuff that's relevant to the people here. Should you write a book, what you can learn from this.
Martin has his hand
I
raised. You
nailed
wanna-
the first big thing,
Yeah.
Well, so I have a question. One, I would just be curious of how many of us would preferred Thinking Fast over The Undoing Project. I'm curious of just where you guys would go with that. And then look at all the thumbs down. And then second, Marcos, you reread it and with an editor's mindset. Would you have eliminated some words? Because it seems like there's a lot of words that if I were Mark Ryder, I would have eliminated.
in here.
Yes. Did you think it was just perfect?
Yeah, I can give you a reason why I think that. Like take for example, he kind of beats it into the ground that Tversky's character is something like that, and Kahneman is slightly different. They're two sides of the same coin, I think. And he actually does it very consciously, I think. If you went back and looked at the chapter, I think it's chapter 3, where he introduces Kahneman and Tversky's character in one chapter. Well, I guess it's more like Kahneman, the first one. It's called the chapter 3. I think it's The Outsider. He just repeats. He literally says that Kahneman is a connoisseur of human error.
Right.
And in chapter 3, when he's profiling his early years, even in Europe and then in Israel, he beats it to death. That Kahneman is paying. He tells his whole story through his observation of other people's stupidity and errors. And so I went through the chapter and I just marked every time he highlighted an error that somebody else made and observed it.
Hmm.
And it's like every 3 pages. So his whole narrative of Kahneman's early life is through the errors he's observed. That's what shaped him. And I think of I'm sure he did it consciously because he had to choose the stories. And I think of it as what they call a leitmotif. You know, in opera, some composers, Wagner was big on this. Whenever a character enters the room, right before he or she shows up, that person's melody that's associated with that character pops up. And I think, not to get too fanciful about it, I think Lewis is doing that. He's saying, oh, Kahneman is emblematic of observing human folly. I have to repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. And so I don't think it's wasted words. It's just kind of layering the idea so that you don't miss it, you know?
Oh, I didn't miss it.
But I don't think he's, you know, keep in mind, he's a pro and he's got a great editor that he's worked with all his life. And they're pretty diligent about cutting out the fat, you know? So I think the book that he ended up with is probably, you know, in the high 90% of what he wanted to end up with. You know, and he does have 2 different leitmotifs for Tversky and Kahneman, even though they're sort of alike. I mean, they get along, but they are complementary characters. And I think I wrote this down somewhere, where he basically says that Tversky is somebody who sees a paradigm and then takes one proposition in that paradigm and then attacks it because it's wrong. And he and I think the line was, somebody is quoted describing him, that's how Amos would begin, by undoing the mistakes of others. And that's one of the first times I think it's only the second time that the word undoing is used in the book, very early on. And that's the title of the book, which in itself is an interesting discussion. And that's just one of many things that he does in there. And so the repetition, and I think when you say too many words, you're talking about repetition, right? I think it's a conscious decision that he was in control of rather than losing sight of. My take. Anybody have thoughts on that?
I think if this were his first book, I think he took liberty with being Michael Lewis.
Probably a good point.
And I think the reader stayed with it because it's damn Michael Lewis. And he's good. Because the reporting is there, but I had that feeling when I was reading it, Mark, and then of course, confirmation bias. I went and found some other critical eyes that kind of confirmed what I was seeing. I mean, I've never written a book, so right, who am I? But I thought it was interesting, and I just kept thinking, what would Mark Ryder say about this? So, but you answered it. I appreciate that.
Okay, good. Back to Amanda for a second. There are a lot of if you want me to talk about it, there are kind of some simple technical things that he does that keep you engaged. For example, an interesting exercise would be to go and look at the first sentence and the last sentence of every chapter. And one thing you would find is he has this, I think the chapters kind of alternate. Sometimes they begin with Amos or Kahneman, but every other time they begin with a third party. He starts off, it's kind of like the concept of in medias res, you know, where you start in the middle of something, and he starts off one chapter or transitions to another part of a chapter by introducing this character you've never heard of. And then 2, 3, 4 pages later, that character interfaces with either Kahneman or Tversky. And that's a pretty good narrative technique that, even if you're writing a book like, an advice book, it's a technique that is worth pursuing. You don't have to start every chapter with yourself, or actually with an advice book, it's kind of easy, and you should be doing it because you could just start off with a client who has a problem, and you come in, presumably you're the one addressing the problem, and you come in 3 or 4 pages later to solve the problem. Mark Goulston, maybe you've encountered that, maybe you've done that. The idea of starting with someone else rather than yourself, or not starting with a concept, but starting with someone's story right in the middle of the story.
Yeah, I can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ruth, you too. Maybe you've done that.
Yeah, I think there's you got to grab people right out of the gate.
Mhm.
And so you want to pique curiosity. And I think starting in the middle of a story, or starting in something that leads almost to a cliffhanger,
Mhm.
grabs people's attention. So yeah, and I think that's very effective, because in people's minds, they know, oh, this is a story. I'm curious. I wonder what the beginning and the ending of it is.
Right.
Yeah. So I have found that pretty helpful. Thank you, Mark.
Well, and as Dean pointed out, this is Lewis, in the peak phase of his career, where he has an audience. He's the best-selling author. His credibility and his skills are unquestioned. So he's got the confidence to do that stuff, and confident that the reader will go along with him. Another thing he did, which I thought was a little fat, the fattest part of the book, was this smart decision to start off. The introduction is why he wrote the book. The next chapter is about this one guy who's the general manager of the Houston Rockets. And it's a long chapter about how you hire people and make draft choices and interview people. And well, why do you do that? And that guy, Daryl Morey, never appears again in the book, I don't think. Why do you do that? And well,
Mark, what you're bringing up it's really interesting, because somebody who's part of 100 Coaches and is a prolific writer, the Amazon reviews are quite polarizing for this person's book. The content is great, but people felt it was too self-serving because the author wrote about themselves so often. And one of the reasons I shy away from talking about myself is, one, my private life is private, so I don't want to put it in a book too much. Second, it's not an autobiography that I'm writing. I'd
Right.
much rather use stories of other people, which frankly are a hell of a lot more fascinating than anything I've ever done. So that's
well, yeah, and in Lewis's case, he's not writing about himself, but I think the idea, what I was trying to get at as well, was the idea, why did he start off with a sports story? Because sports doesn't feature into this. And I think that it's a commercial choice because, probably his most famous book or most influential book is Moneyball. Big movie. Blindside, also a big movie. So he took care of baseball and he took care of football, and he's thinking, basketball. and it's commercially a shrewd choice, but I don't think it was, maybe the first time I read it, I liked it, but the second time I felt like, I know where this is going. This sounds very familiar. And that was the slowest chapter for me. But it does lead off to another technique he does. I think the chapter ends. Hold on a second. I think there's this technique that we've talked about in the previous sessions early on, which I call the karate chop sentence, where you have this very short, simple sentence to button up a chapter and to get people turning the page. And in the basketball thing, he ends it with something, he talks about this general manager, Daryl Morey, wondering, why doesn't anybody see this? The idea that we're thinking about drafting talent all wrong. And the closing line to the sentence is, as it happens, someone had already pointed it out. And that gets you into Kahneman. So he did have an elegant reason for starting off with the sports chapter, because it should grab your attention. And then he transitions into Kahneman and Tversky's story. But the thing and he does this over and over again, this very simple declarative sentence that buttons up a scene or a chapter. And part of the exercise of looking at how he starts and how he finishes is very instructive, I think.
Mark, I have a question. When you're collecting the stories, are you thinking in your mind, okay, each time you're interviewing, is there certain details that you're trying to get out other than someone maybe telling the story? Is there certain questions you're asking or certain things that as a writer you're trying to collect so that like, hey, this is a good story. Now I want to get the whole picture around it to be able to tell this in more narrative fashion, other than just the key point that the person's saying? I'm curious if you have any techniques to kind of bring that out of people to make sure you have everything you want for a story you may use in a book later.
I wish I did have a technique. Mine is, so I did this vanity book thing with a bond trader who wanted to tell his life story for various reasons. Largely because he was very successful. He set up a family trust that would survive him and would skip his 3 daughters and go to help his grandchildren or people he would never see. And it was $100 million. So it was a substantial family trust. And somebody pointed out to him that, look, I mean, your money will be benefiting people who've never met you. You ought to write a book to tell them who you are, just for, privately published, 20 copies. And since and somehow I got connected with him, and at some point I couldn't find him a writers, and I liked him a lot. I said, I'll write it for you. And, but it was about bond arbitrage, which is a little like reading The Big Short or Flash Boys, Lewis's book about electronic trading. And, but anyway, and I said, well, I need to talk to other people. So I talked to his number 2, who now runs a bank in New York, I think. And we met in a bar. I had the tape recorder going, and I said, how'd you get into this? And, how did you get along with this guy? And he tells me this story about how when he moved from BlackRock to this, and his first 6 months, he was making what he thought were really good trades, but he didn't make any profit. So he didn't get a bonus. And he goes to his boss, my bond trader, and he asks him, what am I doing wrong? And apparently my bond trader sat down. He says, well, you're hedging your trades all wrong. And this guy in this bar on a rainy Sunday afternoon in the Village starts explaining. He gave me the 13 essential hedges that I had to do. It was like a checklist. If this trade isn't hedged this way, this way, this way, these are all the problems that can ruin your trade. And this is complicated stuff like option volatility and stuff like that. I do not understand. Anyway, I have it on tape. I transcribe it. And then I go to my bond trader, asked me, well, how'd the interview go with my buddy E.G. was his name. And I said, he told me an interesting thing about this time you sat him down. And my bond trader said, God, I don't remember that, because it was like 20 years ago. And both of them, the guy I interviewed said it was the most important 40 minutes of my life. It changed everything. And his boss, my client, didn't remember it. And so I had to kind of like show him the transcript and explain it all. He basically told me, he said, this little story is worth all the money I'm paying you to write this book. You dug this up. And all I was the vessel, you know. I just asked a leading open-ended question, and the guy went there, gave me some gold. I sent the gold over to my client, and he loved it. And it really changed his thinking, but he'd forgotten it. Now, I think it just by asking an open-ended question, kind of very general, not specific, and people generally answer open-ended questions with what's important to them rather than what's tertiary or way, you know, not important. You know, they tend to go to the good stuff.
Mark, what I love what you shared there too was that you got another perspective on one person's perspective. And I love that it was like something I hadn't thought about until you just shared it, is here's this person that I'm interviewing, I'm getting the story, and we hear their one experience of it, but you went and took another experience of that person, which expanded that whole narrative beyond, because many of the times the gift that someone's giving, they don't remember that they gave it.
Exactly.
I love that you pulled that out. And what I also love that you shared is the rainy Sunday afternoon, which made me think of how do I connect the vividness of where something's happening to then create the place for where a story is told. Yeah.
Well, my kids are always quoting me to myself, this wisdom apparently that I've told them that I don't remember it, you know. And that's why you got to, and that goes back to the deep reporting that Lewis has done here, which is he has talked to a lot of people. And judiciously, he's just used the platinum quotes, you know, all the really good stuff. By the way, another sexy trick that he does is he deals in superlatives. And I love doing this, where it's not that Kahneman and Tversky are smart, but they're always the smartest person in the room, you know. They're always the most intimidating. They're the quickest at seeing something, that sort of thing. So that the subject matter is about excellence, not very good or good, you know. And that just has a lot of sex appeal in terms of getting you from selling 2 copies to 2 million copies, you know.
Or not even the most excellent, but the most bizarre.
Any superlative, you
Yeah.
know, and also could be the biggest asshole too. Pardon my French. So, but that's just, and that is a thing that, that's pretty. People who write these kind of books that sell a lot of copies tend to tell stories about people who are excellent at what they do. And it doesn't have to be a very significant thing. You know, I think I've said this in my earlier workshop things, that my criteria for writing books with people is this person the best at what he does, and I've pretty much stuck to that criteria. That's where I start. Marshall he could be legitimately called the best executive coach. When I did one with the choreographer Twyla Tharp, she's the best American choreographer. You could argue that, but she's certainly in the conversation. When I did a chess book, it was with Gary Kasparov, and me, I'm just working with the best, I'm just their vessel for getting it out. But in the same key, when you are selecting stories to tell in your book, try to make the subject of the story be somehow superlative. Find something that they are legitimately superlative, a superlative model of, and now that's not always possible, but I certainly think it just elevates the conversation. Lisa?
Yes, I love that thought. And at the same time, we also have to be cautious because what someone considers superlative today may not be superlative in a year from now. Just look at FTX, look at Jack Welch, look at some of the luminaries who have fallen from their thrones because they were we were hoodwinked by some of their, some industries or media pundits putting them on pedestals. So we have to also be very careful at not following someone else's narrative of what a superlative coach or CEO or sports figure looks like. We're in a very tumultuous period socially. Would you agree?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I was Jack Welch's agent. So when we've talked about this on these calls, somebody asked about, there's a recent book really taking him down, but it was, his book came out over 20 years ago, and he's dead now. And my only answer to that was, for my purposes, Jack was superlative at the time we sold his book and at the time the book came out. And, history is all about change. I wouldn't worry about 20 years hence. We might be dead,
Mark, there's a couple people with their hands up. Lisa?
Lisa?
Yeah, sort of on that vein, can you talk about a superlative asshole or something, what you said? I think that is really interesting when you talk about the best. So many times we read that as a reader and it can be helpful, but it can also be like, I can't do that. And when you said asshole, if you could elaborate on this point, one of the things that helped me was I thought, well, I'm not going to do that, sort of that kind of reaction. Could you just elaborate a little bit more that a superlative doesn't have to be a positive?
Well, oh yeah, absolutely. People like to read about other people misbehaving in world-class ways.
This is why the Jack Welch book that came out this year has sold so well.
Yeah. The buildup is great, and the takedown can be just as interesting, but a lot of the people you're coaching, in many cases you're coaching below the radar, hopefully extraordinary people, but below the radar. They're not the subject, they're not in the Wall Street Journal every other day. And they're not working for public companies, perhaps, but you've got to be able to find something that makes them, that justifies why you're working with them. And he he or she could be the best parent on, 3rd Avenue in Peoria, then they're great at something. And you just kind of narrow it down, narrow it down, narrow it down. I call it slicing the loaf. Get the thinnest loaf of excellence, but it's still excellence,
I
It-
think that he is really good at just finding what's peculiar about each person so that he can make an incredibly rich character. So in The Big Short, he had this one-eyed ex-doctor, recluse, autistic, brilliant person who had a mail order bride. And that person was one of the few people who outsmarted the entire world in betting on the collapse in 2008. So he just finds these odd things. And I bet he might have interviewed 10 people, 9 of whom were not very interesting. And he found this one-eyed ex-doctor recluse. And he said, that's the guy that's going to make this book.
Yeah. Michael Burry, right? Yeah. That's exactly it. And he does talk to, once he finds somebody who's such a character,
Mm-hmm.
contrarian and eccentric, of course you grab onto that. There was a long time ago, the New Yorker had a movie critic named Pauline Kael, and she was
Legendary. You have to say legendary in front of Pauline Kael, don't you?
legendary. Pauline Kael.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
she had this admirable and annoying habit of, every time she reviewed a movie positively, she would find a superlative for the director or the movie or the actors or whoever wrote it. And she would say, this is, probably the greatest film in black and white about Serbian dwarfs
Birds.
in New York City, or something like that. She would tailor the categories of superlativeness so it was accurate, but she would just go all over the place to build the superlative. She would do this every time in a positive review, or even in a negative review. To get to you, Lisa, she would say, this is the worst, black and white movie about dwarfs, it's et cetera, et cetera. It could have been so much better. And then she would cite an example. But it's a trick. This dealing in superlatives rather than comparatives, or just plain old adjectives. And I just would recommend it whenever possible.
Mark Golson has his hand raised also. Mark?
Hi, thanks. Something that I do on my podcast occasionally when someone has a new book out, towards the end, because I want to crisp up the potential customers, I say, can you share with us a nugget from the book that is counterintuitive, meaning people's reaction is going to be, I never would have thought of that, and it's relevant to me. Second, intuitively correct, I think that would work. And thirdly, doable by regular people. You don't have to be a genius to do it. So I never would have thought of that. I think that could work, and I think we could actually do it. And they can always come up with something. And so it's I don't know that highlights excellence, but I want to make it easy for the listener to have a takeaway that they can use. And authors, they love coming up with something. They'll pause. When you can ask a question where people pause and they look up at the ceiling to think about it in their mind's eye, and they come back to you, they are non-transactional.
Right.
So I just wanted to share that.
No, well, that gets to Chris's question. It's another way of interviewing somebody and getting gold out of them. Not my way, but because yours is a little more efficient than mine. I just stick around for 3 hours until they say something. But maybe I should try that. You mentioned this, I think on a phone call you mentioned this, Mark. Yeah, I should learn from this.
Hmm.
Peter?
Yeah, I had two questions. One around this superlative thing and actually keying off something. I can't remember who said it. It might have been Ruth. This idea of like whose life is interesting and whose life is not interesting. And I think what like I think this is a little bit my style, but it also is what interests me, is to find what's think about sorry, I'm not finishing a sentence. To find what's interesting about otherwise potentially not interesting people. Meaning, I think about Tuesdays with Morrie is the thing that came to mind. There was nothing particularly interesting about either of them. One of them had ALS, and for some reason I'm forgetting. I love this guy, but I can't remember his name as the author of who wrote Tuesdays with Morrie.
Mitch Albom. Mitch
Yeah,
Albom.
thank you, Mitch Albom. And I was thinking of him when you said sports, because he reminds me of Michael Lewis in a number of ways. Totally different writing style, but there's something about the two of them that remind me of each other. And Mitch Albom took this thing, which is like deeply and incredibly mundane, actually, and was able to bring out the sort of magic and the superlativeness in the in the otherwise very mundane people and situations. And I think in terms of, I don't know, I'm curious to get your perspective on that in terms of readership, in terms of engaging people around that stuff. There's something I'm really drawn to around that. And then I have one more quick question.
Well, that's a good point, but I would reduce Tuesdays with Morrie into a genre. Maybe Mitch sort of created the genre. Well, didn't create it, wasn't the first, but it's about a teacher-student relationship. It's about a mentor and a mentee. And when you have that narrative structure, you get a really juicy liftoff from that, because you are not telling people what you know, you are telling people what you learned.
Right.
And that gives you a built-in narrative. And Lewis is doing the same thing here. The narrative is of Tversky. I mean, they don't even meet till chapter 5.
I want to pause for a second, because I think what you just said is really, really important, both in terms of all of our writing, but also in terms of like what makes for a narrative, right? What makes for a narrative is that you are learning something as opposed to what you know. If I tell you what I know, that is deeply uninteresting, I think, right? But the process of learning it is what seems to be really engaging. And in that way, I think Mitch Albom and Michael Lewis, I mean, I think that's what Michael Lewis, that's how he unravels a story. That's good storytelling, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, well, that's certainly the basis. Well, there's it's like kingdom, phylum, down to genus, down to species, or whatever the order is. I mean, the kingdom concept here, if I was doing a Linnaeus hierarchy here, is he starts with the overriding premise of his books is everything you know is wrong.
Right.
Right? Let's start with there. And that's certainly the Undoing Project. Everything you know is wrong, and here are two guys that prove it, right? And then once he starts with that, then he shows how each of them approach that concept together, that notion in behavioral psychology and economics. One approaches it from taking the paradigm and attacking it, the other being curious about human folly. And then in chapter 5 in the book, it's called The Collision. They finally meet, and get along. And then they teach themselves through discussions, and they are learning, always, they're always learning. and you're following that process, you never really know what they know, you know, you just
Right.
learn along with them. And it's certainly what I try to do in Marshall's books. Marshall doesn't tell you what you know. He makes a mistake and he learns from it, and then he moves on, and you learn with him. It's like absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Now, not all of you are going to make yourselves, as much as Marshall does, the personality in their book, or maybe you will. But it's still, you're taking a reader on a journey. That's the key.
Right.
And that's what Mitch does in that particular book. You know, that's why it's
Malcolm Gladwell, Malcolm Gladwell writes exactly the same way, right? It's like these incredibly popular writers they're storytellers. They're like, it's the slow reveal.
yeah, he does it. He's different than Lewis, but I guess he does.
You thought
Thinking
that big cars were safer. Let me tell you about a story.
well,
about
definitely
Bob Ross.
everything you, yeah.
And then you know, and here's what this does. And it turns out that the safety of a car is as much on its maneuverability as it is on its outside structure. And you know, like he's
kind of
I feel
revealing
like-
it with you.
Yeah.
You're sharing the experience of him figuring it out.
him figuring it out. And that's what I feel like you're saying, Mark, is that these great writers are sharing with the great narrative, and the great storytelling is figuring it out. Like, you're going to come along with me and we're going to figure this out together. And I'm going to take you through the story of how I figured this out. And there's an, you know, I could make it a very short article. I could tell you, by the way, a Jetta is safer than a Suburban, because it turns out that maneuvering a car is more useful than, you know, like chances are you're going to get into a multi-car accident, not with a tree. And so maneuvering the car is going to be much more useful.
Right.
And we're done. But, you know, 5,000 words later, it's a much more interesting story. Because there's, you know, he's taking you through the learning process.
Yeah. For this group's purposes, we got to be careful. That's why I go back to the big thing is that Lewis is a journalist. He's never the center of the story.
Right.
A lot of this group's, I'm looking at all of you.
Mhm.
This group, you're going to have to be in the story because you're talking about your clients, unless, and you're talking about personal experience. So,
Right.
so as Ruth says, it's not an autobiography, but there's a hint of memoir in there where you're talking about your clients, and the key is to write it. So when you talk, you client hires you, they've got a problem. It's your right. You have to write it in such a way that they go on you take the reader on the journey as you learn what the client's problems, misapprehend what the problem is. You think it's really this or that. And then when you figure that out, things go a little more smoothly. And then there's another hiccup in the relationship and in the solving of the client's problems. And you take the reader along. And a lot of times in bad books, people are in a hurry, are too in a hurry to get to the solution without showing you all the challenges along the way, because the challenges are what's interesting.
Right.
It's a challenge. How did I solve it? You know, Lisa?
Yes, thank you for making that distinction. It was very helpful because I'm in talks now with my publisher on my next book, and they said, oh, and by the way, when you write your chapters, make sure you keep them at or below 3,500 words each. So they're not looking for a 5,000 to 8,000 word story like Michael Lewis would write. They're saying put them in digestible pieces and chunks. So I don't, that's just an update on what Palgrave and Springer are doing. And
It now
might
needs to fit in
also,
a TikTok video.
I mean, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with it. I'm just saying that they also recognize the way in which most people, especially business people, digest content these days certainly is different than it was 20 years ago
Well,
Lisa,
or
can I just-
5 years ago.
Can I jump in on this? Because I was in those debates with my HBR editor who was saying, hey, you know what? I had a new editor at HBR. And she said, you know what? Your articles are 1,200 words and you really need to get your word count down to like 600 words. That's what people are reading. Right. And I said, send me a couple of really good 600 word articles. And which there's plenty of good ones. But the way she would want to take my 1,200 word article and bring it to 600 is get to the point faster and lose a lot of the narrative. And so, my answer in the end was like, how are my numbers? Like, are people reading my 1,200 word articles or are they not reading my 1,200 word articles? And I think, I don't know, I've become very suspicious of fitting a mold that an editor thinks like this is what you need to do in order to make it readable, which by the way might be true, but I find people are more if you're writing something interesting, people are more willing to stick with it. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in because I've long debated that, and I'll spend 8 hours on a 1,200 word article, and I'll spend 6 of those hours in the first 300 words to try to make the story a story and make it interesting and make it engaging and draw people in so that they want to read the rest of the article.
Right. Thank
you.
I suspect it's also different audiences, right?
Yeah.
Right. Some audiences want to obviously, Mark, these writers that you're talking about have audiences that, speaking for myself, like I enjoy each word. Like I just like the process of the way I like their voice, and taking some of those luscious words out would be criminal for me, right? Because I'm not just there for like the information. Whereas, depending on where the thing is showing up, maybe that's all people want is the information.
Well, back to Lisa's editor, Palgrave. I don't know. You might want to think about pushing back on it, or just continue. Find a nice karate chop for to end the 3,500 word chapter, and then keep going with it in the next chapter. Their chapters are sometimes artificial. They're artificial barriers, or containers. You can continue a story in another chapter. Thriller writers do it all the time. In fact, that's the only thing they do. I remember in college, I took this film course in philosophy class in which you watched a film twice every week. Then you had to write a 2-page essay on it, 2 pages, right? And I had so much more to say, and I was so much more verbose that how do I keep it to 2 pages? And I just said, well, I just won't hand it. I'll single space it instead of double spacing it.
Hey, Mark, we're at the end of the hour. I hit that up, and I just want to note, I think this is the completion of the first year cycle of these calls.
Yes.
Because I think we started January of last year, and I just want to say, I'll speak for everybody because I know everybody agrees. This has been masterful and terrific, and I love what you're doing. I hope you'll continue. No guilt, no obligation. But if you're still having fun, I'm still having fun.
Oh, I
really appreciate it.
I love this. I love this.
Yeah.
Just the challenge of having to read The Undoing Project again. No, it was great. It was great. And I noticed I haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what I've noticed.
Yeah. No, and it's fun the way you take us on our own journey on these calls and explore different spaces. I just think is really wonderful. And by the way, all these calls, I think all of them, I've been downloading and putting into a folder someplace. And and there's a link in the calendar invite that can get you to any of the previous meetings that we've had. This one I think was particularly interesting. Anyhow, I just wanted to say thank you, and congratulations on the completion of the first year.
Do we want to continue? If people show up, yeah, good. And now We just
Ah.
got to come up with themes to talk about. If you want to continue, this is a pretty big book. There's a lot of stuff in it. And as I say, if you want to understand coaching, Michael Lewis is a great place to start reading all his books. If you, we can continue talking about this book, the next session, if you want, because a lot of stuff, we barely talked about the book in many ways. It just, it's a lot of ideas and problems spin off from it.
Mark, my observation is sometime between now and the first Tuesday of January, you will be inspired for the topic of the next thing. And you may be inspired to say, you know what, we have more undoing to do on the undoing, or you're going to find something else that's going to tickle your fancy. And I suspect either one is going to be amazing.
Okay, I'll think about it, and you and I will talk. I think unless somebody else has a better suggestion right now. I keep going back to Amanda because she's read this twice now. Is there more you want to hear?
I would definitely prefer to stick with this book, because then we can all just concentrate, and there's so much in there to apply to our own writing. I think we should continue with this. I think we could go on this book for 2 years personally.
Great.
And Mark, I'd like to do a little bit more insight into your mind. What other book would you recommend?
The thing that's interesting about Michael Lewis in tackling the Undoing Project is he enters this world of people who are influenced by Kahneman and Tversky, and two of them are highlighted in the book. And so I have them here. If you want to be in the same vein of how we make decisions and how we perceive reality and interpret it, you could do worse than stick with Kahneman and the people who were influenced by him. And one that comes to mind is this book, Noise. I think it's a bestseller right now. It's with Kahneman and Cass Sunstein. And another one is by another guy who was influenced by Kahneman, Richard Thaler, an economist at Chicago, who also, as a result of Kahneman, won a Nobel Prize. And again, with Cass Sunstein, who's a very prolific and brilliant man, Nudge. And these are both bestsellers, and they're takeoffs on the ideas in the Undoing Project. That would be kind of like ancillary reading. I don't think as interesting for our purposes for discussions, because they're not as well written as Michael Lewis. I mean, the gloss and the expertise that Michael Lewis evinces is more interesting, I think, but they're certainly meaty and fascinating subjects. It would be more content in that case, but I'm inclined to go with people raising their hands and saying, let's just continue doing the Undoing Project as a takeoff, because we haven't scratched the surface. And Dean's job is to come up with more poetry. And
Okay, I'm on it. We'll write
Anyway.
it in the voice of Tupac.
yeah.
Happy holidays, everyone. I need to jump.
Yep.
This was awesome as
Bye, everybody.
usual.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much.
One.
Thanks.